Welcome, everyone, to the first of 3 Friday sessions following the innovative hybrid 2022 American Weil Society at the University of Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana. Our own Emily King will be introducing Professor Alexander Nemerov from Stanford University, who will speak on Simone Weil and Giotto. Simone Weil wrote, quote, "Giotto's painting is an expression of holiness." Emily King is a graduate student at the University of Chicago Divinity School, where she was awarded the Elsa Mardi Fellowship in Ministry. She holds a BA in English with distinction from Stanford University, where she was awarded the Robert M. Golden Medal for Excellence in the Humanities for her honors thesis, Poetry as Decreation, Impersonality and Grace in T.S. Eliot and Simone Weil. We are fortunate to have Emily on the American Weil Society leadership team.
Thank you, Jane, for the introduction. I'm so honored to be here to introduce Professor Alexander Nemerov and to moderate questions at this panel today. Alexander Nemerov is Carl and Marilyn Thoma Provostial Professor in the Arts and Humanities at Stanford University, where his classes routinely draw scores of students, myself included once upon a time, and where he is sometimes informally known as Stanford's art history preacher for his deeply felt and compelling lectures. As a personal side, as Jane mentioned, I was privileged to have Professor Nemerov as a reader for my undergraduate thesis on Simone Weil and T.S. Eliot in 2019. Before joining Stanford, Nemerov was a professor in art history at Yale University. A scholar of American art, Nemerov writes about the presence of art, the recollection of the past, and the importance of the humanities in our lives today. His publications include Summoning Pearl Harbor, Soulmaker, The Times of Lewis Hine, Icons of Grief, Val Lewton's Home Front Pictures, and the body of Raphael Peale, Still Life and Selfhood. His most recent publication is Fierce Poise, Helen Frankenthaler and 1950s New York. Today, we have the distinct honor of hearing him speak on Simone Weil and Giotto. Professor Nemerov, welcome.
I'm so pleased to be here with all of you. I'm honored, daunted too by the task to speak about Simone Weil and Giotto. Simone Weil is someone who has been made very present for me by Emily, the person who has just so kindly introduced me. And, Emily's discourse with me during the time she was a student, as well as since she has gone on to Chicago, has been a prime instance of the way I've learned so much from my most special students over the years. And, this talk could not be but for that interaction. So I'm so grateful for what that represents in the singular, in the specific, in terms of my friendship with Emily, but also just in a broader sense about what pedagogy is. So I want to say here that I will not be presenting a quote unquote historical argument. I am not presenting as an expert or even as a scholar or even as a professor. I find those things to be not helpful or interesting as I get older. What I would like to do is think about Simone Weil's encounter with Giotto in Assisi and Florence in 1937 as a site, S-I-T-E, for us now, today, to think about matters that concern us as thinkers, as students. And what I mean by that, when I say matters, is the relation between faith, ethics, and thought, and how that manifests in who we are as teachers, students, in our way of being in the world. So more of a philosophical meditation here, prompted by, drawn from Weil and Giotto in 1937 in Assisi and Florence. Let me say, when I was first given the opportunity to do this talk, and I said yes, fairly soon after, the image of a circle, and also the idea of the center, circles and centers, popped into my head or appeared to me as the right requisite terms for what I was about to say. And I have learned to pay a lot of attention to what appears mysteriously in my head that can guide me. And so today's talk is very much about, yes, this confluence of philosopher and Renaissance artist Giotto as a site, S-I-T-E, but also as a center for us to converge upon, but truly in the deepest sense, as you'll see in everything I'm about to say today, a decentering, and the question then of how we consider ourselves as decentered individuals when we think, when we teach, is very much on my mind in my remarks. So what you're looking at here is the upper church in the Basilica of St. Francis there in Assisi, one of the places there where they went. And, it was in Assisi, as she said, that she first dropped to her knees. And so it's one of these moments in 1937-38 when, as I've learned, she really encountered and was, if you like, penetrated by Christian faith. So you're looking at, on the side walls and all the way to the end, then some of the frescoes painted there, 28 in number, concerning the life of St. Francis, who is the key figure, obviously, in Assisi, and indeed the light around which Weil's own thoughts converged in this momentous summer of 1937. And those frescoes were thought to be by Giotto at the time. Maybe they are. It doesn't seem that they likely are. They thought that they were. In any case, it hardly matters. They're extraordinary pictures. And what I'd like to do is now look at some of these with you and try to focus on, yes, again, these aspects of centering and decentering. I mean, you can imagine, if you're the artist, you've got a challenge here, because in portrayals such as this, one of the 28 frescoes of the stigmatization on La Verna, you've got a challenge because your central figure is very much of a decentering, or, if you like, bashful figure. So how to show him centrally, but also in a sort of, complex relation to being central. And, when I make these remarks, I'm not by any stretch of the imagination trying to imagine what Weil herself thought about these works. I'm more or less, again, imagining using her encounter with them as a basis for my thoughts now. So, looking at this picture of St. Francis receiving the stigmata on the part of this Jesus, who is enveloped in this six-winged seraph appearing to him in the heavens, with then likely Father Leo at lower right, who is the kind of amanuensis for this event. Francis is more or less centered, yes. But, I was thinking of all the ways that he's not there, in a sense. And I was thinking of the relation between attention, recitation, and love as all constituting a form of emptying out, if you like, in this picture. And what I mean by that is, in ways that Weil herself has taught me to appreciate, attention obviously has to do with a kind of emptying and dissolving of one's conscious, agitated, active mind. And, she says that attention consists in precisely this kind of thing, leaving our thought detached, empty, and ready to be penetrated by the object. You could say that about St. Francis here. We do not obtain the most precious gifts by going in search of them, but by waiting for them. And above all, our thoughts should be empty, waiting, not seeking anything, but ready to receive in its naked truth the object that is to penetrate it. So here. And then in terms of recitation, there's St. Francis's ritual acts, penitential self-scourging that deliver him up in concert with attention to these miraculous manifestations. In Weil's sense, I think of the well-known story of how in 1938, the year after, in the French monastery of Solesmes, an English tourist gave her a copy or introduced her to George Herbert's poetry from the 17th century. You can see here, Weil's ecstasy at the poem Love, describing it to a friend. It was when Christ came to take me. I believed I was merely re-saying a beautiful poem. That is, as she's describing, having recited it to herself at a moment when, for the first time, Christ came to take me. So it's a kind of, if you like, stigmatization. I believed I was merely re-saying a beautiful poem, and unbeknownst to myself, it was a prayer, re-saying a beautiful poem. So attention, concentration, recitation, and emptying, right? And then also, not incidentally, that word love too, right? And for many of you, Herbert's poem will be extremely well known, but so I appreciate your patience for this novice in putting it here and then reciting it to you. I think it does bear on these questions, which I'm trying to learn and consider for myself, to be, if you like, stigmatized by myself as I go forth. So love bade me welcome, yet my soul drew back, guilty of dust and sin. But quick-eyed love, observing me grow slack from my first entrance in, drew nearer to me, sweetly questioning if I lacked anything. A guest, I answered, worthy to be here. Love said, you shall be he. I, the unkind, the ungrateful. Ah, my dear, I cannot look on thee. Love took my hand and smiling did reply, who made the eyes but I? Truth, Lord, but I have marred them. Let my shame go where it doth deserve. And know you not, says love, who bore the blame? My dear, then I will serve. You must sit down, says love, and taste my meat. So I did sit and eat. So the opening that love creates is in concert with attention and recitation, the passageway in which, if you look at these magical lines pinioning Francis to the apparition of Jesus, creates those binds that are almost like the strings between a kite and the flyer of the kite that open us up, decenter us, make us not there, make us light, like the kite. Let's look at now another picture from Assisi, and this is actually, if one were following in sequence, the first of the 28 scenes, and of course we have no idea in what order, or if indeed in order at all, they saw these, and nor of course does it matter. But I can imagine her really looking at this picture a lot. I find it to be extraordinary myself, and here it is from an early moment in St. Francis's life, very much when he's still in, in his guise as a well-to-do son of a well-to-do merchant in Florence. Francis's dates, by the way, 1182 to 1226. He's walking in front of what is the Temple of Minerva, a 1st century BC Roman ruin there in Assisi, and a so-called simple man. And by simple, I'm not sure quite what to make, but a naive believer, let's call him, with a premonition of the man's holiness, lays down a garment for him to walk on as the burghers of the town look on in mystification and consternation. So, centering, I think the most vivid thing about this is that there's not kind of dramatically nothing going on in the center. And yes, you could say, well, the temple is the center, but it's an unpopulated, doorless temple. Weil herself says the empty space, she's not talking about this work in particular, but all of Giotto's work, the empty space, which Giotto more often than not places in the center, procedure of extraordinary power, here, has itself just as much existence in his art as the parts with people, in fact, more existence. And I think that's true here. And if you, consider this empty temple, which there is the Temple of Minerva, and notice that the Temple of Minerva has no Christian rose window, which the artist incorporates in a way that predicts the rose windows that would eventually grace the facade of the Basilica of St. Francis itself. It's a compound classical religious structure of emptiness. Now, what is the import of that for what I'm thinking about today? It would just be this, that Francis's holiness has a very complex relation to centeredness, which is itself complicated. And let me just try to put that more simply. You might say that he's about to step into the center. It's sort of like, Olivier as Henry V walking on stage from backstage, and now he's fully resonant in his role. But I think that's a little cheap or simplistic. I think if we do imagine Francis setting forth into the center onto the garment on the ground, we'd still have to say that he, though central, is not in the temple. He is separate from the institution. If you like, as a thinker, as an intellect, as a man of faith, he is in relation to the institution, but he is separate from the institution. So it's a centeredness of the public sphere. This is a public space, but it's not institutional. And more than that, the institution itself, the longer I look at it, this classical church of sorts with the rose window and, flanked by angels there, does actually pick up on and seems to embody, for all its distinctness, its apartness from Francis, some aspects of his combination of faith, intellect, and being. And I mean that in part because the rose window echoes his own halo there, and the halo, the center, the circle in both cases is a kind of magical, swirling, perfected, godly image that is sort of separate from architecture, separate from the piazza, separate from space and time. But also, I look at those two windows inside on the porch of the temple, and I think, in one sense, they track horizontally with all five figures or 5 of the 6 figures as emblems of the interiority of each, fair enough. But I don't know, they seem in their shadedness, their secludedness, their hiddenness, to have something in particular in common with Francis's own inwardness. Okay, so, you might be asking yourself as a young scholar, can inwardness exist in an institutional context? Yes, it can. Can holiness exist within an institutional context? Yes, it can. Can one remain apart from the institutional context in which, nonetheless, its very windows and its rose windows and its centrality and circularity, speak to what is best about oneself? Can one remain distinct from it? Yes, one can. Can one remain a simple person, respected by simple people, not by those whose thoughts go up, up, up very high into ever more Piranesian structures? Can one have a horizontal relation to one's own thought and being and be in some sort of complex relation to the central institution? Yes, one can. And the way to do that, this is how I wrote it for myself. I'm not quoting anyone here except myself. Consciousness, or if you like, thought, is a temple whose center is empty. So it won't make you a good chair. It won't make you a good administrator, because your mind will always be a kind of beautiful empty temple, but that's the best place to be. I want to bring up another aspect of centering and decentering here by turning to this image, which I, again, of course, find strangely affecting. And not just because it introduces animals into the scenes, and I like creatures. And there's that wonderfully docile, affectionate donkey there. But here's another scene from early in St. Francis's life. In fact, this is the second of the 28, and it's immediately adjacent to the scene we just saw at the upper church of St. Francis, again, still in his, wealthy kind of playboy years as a late teenager person in his early 20s, who's nonetheless always had a kind of love of other people and very much of a sense of empathy. And so in this case, he, having, acquired all sorts of wonderful clothing, finery, has nonetheless, upon seeing a knight, like an aristocratic figure who's fallen on hard times, wandering in the countryside, has voluntarily, and much to the astoundment of the knight, taken off one of his rich garments and given it to him. So an act of giving and of indeed selflessness that prefigures much. Now, looking at it, St. Francis is very much central, as narratively it makes sense for him to be. This is visual in terms of the way the slope of this mountain comes down and this mountain comes up. He's very much at the meeting place of those two lines. His feet, he has one foot in this, if you like, more relatively complex and worldly and urban environment here, and one foot over there. These 2 feet kind of express the scissoring X of the 2 slopes. But nonetheless, he is, if you like, offloading some of this centeredness in the form of the luxurious garment over to the right. And as I've come to think of it, as you watch the garment kind of slide away from him, almost as though it's part of a kind of landslide motion from the terrain itself. And as you watch the garment, if you like, docilely give itself or be given to the other man here in the way that it echoes the kind of Eeyore downbeat docility of the donkey. It's almost as though St. Francis is saying, here's a gob of centeredness, take it, it's a cloak, it's a mantle, it's a guise, it's a disguise here, please, sir, you can have it. And maybe it's finally a kind of equivocal gift. Be careful of what you wish for, but in any case, it's offered in good faith, and it's in any case something that St. Francis does not want. The giving away of centeredness. And Weil says very well, we live in a world of unreality and dreams, meaning our egos, our individuality, our prosperity, our pain, all that seems to make us the center of the world. To give up our imaginary position as the center, to renounce it, not only intellectually, but in the imaginative part of our soul. That means to awaken to what is real and eternal, to see the true light and hear the true silence. So it's in the name of the true light and the true, true silence that one divests oneself of one's centeredness. And as we turn now to maybe the most famous, along with the stigmatization of the scenes associated with St. Francis's life, namely the Sermon to the Birds, we can see more of this divestment or decentering, except in a different form now, as it takes the form of speech, of preach. Something that any public speaker, such as me right now in speaking, can attend to. Do one's words go forth into the world as a kind of, ever ramifying sort of number of clicks and of popularity, and therefore of one's own individuality, as one attempting more or less in the manner of a grotesque social media phenomenon to centralize oneself or establish a colony of multiply centered selves in the act of public speaking. Oftentimes, unfortunately, that is how it can be construed. But I think obviously the opposite is the case here, that in making his speech, his Sermon to the Birds, St. Francis is, in a way, that the words leaving one's mouth are an emptying of the self, not a puffing out of the self, right? And maybe that empty space here, which in addition to the birds or apart from the birds, is maybe something we don't see quite so clearly, and yet is very requisite to the whole scene, particularly in the way that the hill kind of slopes down, the countryside slopes down here in concert with St. Francis's own bending gesture. That speaking is a kind of emptying. Speaking in this way, I would say, speaking in a way that is sanctified is an emptying. And in a possibly annoying play on words, I just thought of it too. And when we speak about the humility of public speaking, which is quite another thing from the humbling nature of it, they're related but different. Decenter and descender, when we speak, we decenter. When we speak in a sanctified way, we decenter as we descend. And I think this one bird who is, a latecomer to the scene and, just coming in after the room is closed or whatever, but is nonetheless getting there fast, is in the most lovely way, is on this horizontal with St. Francis, as if speaking to the fact that in flight, that descending is a part of flight too. Up and down are beautifully confused, just in the way that the tree here, which this big broccoli tree, which so beautifully expresses the ferment down below, seems in concert with the birds in whose shade, the tree's shade gives these birds a place to be. They are in relation to it even as the bursting pods of the tree express the ecstasy of the scene. So, you know, the ethics of eccentric speech, you know, not centralizing speech. The buck stops here. The State of the Union, it has its own kind of ethics, but we're talking about another kind of politics here, the kind that is the most meaningful way, for me at least, of being a thinker, a scholar in public, which is to be a dissenter, a dissender. And then if you wanted to even be more annoying in the play on words, you could say dissenter, dissenter. Sauvé says to give up being the center of the world in imagination, to discern that all points in the world are equally centers and that the true center is outside the world. This is to consent to the rule of mechanical necessity and matter and a free choice at the center of each soul. Such consent is love. And, you know, there's St. Francis's love of nature here, his faith in this, his belief in the souls of individual birds and so on. And to me, that implies another ethics of public speaking, which is one finds, locates, names, praises, lifts up in descending the implicit concentric circles of other souls. These birds will carve, they will describe arcs in the air, you know, widening spheres and gyres, independent of control. And Francis, in this sanctified speech act, is creating those circling spheres that will populate this sky, right? And I was thinking about this in the, of course, quite specific context of Weil in Italy in 1937-38, and just thinking that her coming to Christianity or coming to St. Francis or coming to George Herbert in those years, you know, has to be understood against the backdrop or in conversation with the fascism that was present there, of course, on every street corner and every cafe all around her, and which she confronted so bravely and unintimidatedly. But obviously, the implication of the Speech Act for a politician, a fascist politician such as Mussolini, is that one is not creating multiple centers, but rather multiple versions of oneself or one's own ideology. And, you know, when I think about the import of comparisons such as this for us now in terms of our intellectual life, I think it often can be seen to be, how can I put it, unhelpful in response to repressive politics, to go preach to the birds. This friar here, whose own manifestations of ecstasy are somewhat less abundant than what's happening over here, is perhaps, you know, an example of the most well-meaning and would be sympathetic of those who might observe, witness such an eccentric act that seems to be so otherworldly as to be beside the point, especially in repressive times. But I would hold up to you, in view of this comparison, that such is not the case. That, you know, the decentering, the descending is an act of such humility and grace as to make a difference in the world. And I could say more about that, but I think I won't. Another aspect of this decentering for me, staying here in Assisi, is just this, that the natural world in Weil's conception offers us a kind of resistance, a kind of texture and traction that invites us to create, to discern, to shape our own powers of love, right? That dealing with the world in its own textural complexity and difference from us, its unhelpfulness from us, as in this scene where there's a man St. Francis is traveling with who's just deathly thirsty in the arid, beating heat of the Umbrian summer, can be a means of accessing God much more powerful and authentic even than concoursing with the invisible, which they can regard with some suspicion. So looking at this, you have two friars over here, another donkey. Here's St. Francis, who is responding to the man's lament by praying to, intellectually what we can imagine to be like a higher power, who then delivers the, as it were, rain in the form of this gushing spring stream coming out of nowhere in a place from which no water was ever known to issue, such that the man can slake his thirst with his kind of salamander posture as he almost grips the ground. His right foot, for example, just making such a beautiful echo with the jaunty curve of his cap, there, lip of his cap, and there we would have it. But the more I look at this, and relative to our idea of, the central act that is actually kind of decentered, and our decentering taking the form, in this case, of an acknowledgement of nature's otherness and of God's love present in that otherness, is that St. Francis, visually, intellectually he's praying to God, but visually he's really like climbing a mountain. It's hard, it's difficult. There is traction here, like on a climbing wall, or the whole landscape reminds me a little bit of the bottom of like a running shoe, like grip texture, but this same kind of texture is also resistant. You can trip, you can fall. In any case, it's an arduous thing. Prayer is arduous in this case, but I think, a prayerful relation to the beauty of nature is arduous, at least in this case, because that which one loves does not simply give itself or surrender itself. And the act here then seems in relation to this. Yes, this act of prayer produces in the story this result. It's like a gumball machine where you put in the coin and then out comes from the little spigot at the bottom the reward, the recompense. But thinking less literally about the scene, it's these two figures are the active figures. They're like the superheroes. These are the kind of bystanders. It's like these two figures burst out A, burst out B, and they're actively engaged with the otherness of nature, whereas these are just figures who are just kind of passing through. And, Weil says, every true artist has had real, direct, and immediate contact with the beauty of the world, contact that is of the nature of a sacrament. So the very artist who made this work is himself practicing this active relation, which is a composite of prayer and physical, almost kind of like reptilian, sensuous delectation in the natural world. And I'll just keep that quote up on the screen here as we go in for this nice detail of this magical man. There's another aspect of this figure here, which I think speaks to this notion of decentering that's happening here when he, in a very creaturely way, delights in the sacredness of nature's otherness, the otherness of beauty. And it's that he seems like, not only an instance of Weil's words, let us love the country of here below, here, it is real, it offers resistance to love. It is this country that God has given us to love. He has willed it He's willed that it should be difficult yet possible to love it. Not only that, but also he seems like a narcissist to me. But notice a kind of, if this is even possible, a decentered narcissus, a man who looks into the water and does not see himself. And I think that selflessness comports beautifully with his marginal position at the edge, which, correspondingly allows him, in the manner of the simple man, to have a direct relation to the kind of lush, gushing, resistant, forceful, life-giving power of prayer, and of prayer's being in the world, prayer and the world not having a cause and effect relationship, but rather being bound up in a kind of poetry of decentralization. If we come back to this and just look at these two pictures we just talked about, together now, I just want to point something out, perhaps with a little bit too much of an irrepressible art historian's nerdiness, about where they're located in the basilica, because if you look at this admittedly very dark image, which is sort of screen captured by me from a video on YouTube, I think maybe you'll just have to believe me, but that's the Sermon to the Birds, and this is the magical occurrence of the spring here. So they're flanking one another, and then above them, of course, as you can't help but see here, is this rose window, and which was not there, so far as I know, at the time that the artist painted these pictures in the late 13th century, but nonetheless constitutes, and there it is again, constitutes an important part of one's encounter with those works, that there is this center that is elsewhere, this kind of floating, otherworldly, endless, infinite, ball above them. And, for Weil, well, who knows? Again, I'm not in the business of arbitrating what she did and did not see as though that were possible, but I think it's telling in this context. And if we go from this rose window in that church now to the other church that I mentioned at the start of this talk, namely, I mentioned we'd be going to Florence as well as Assisi, and we look at Santa Croce there in Florence, where they also went in 1937. And, you're looking at its 19th century facade with its Star of David, about which different legends have emerged. But yes, the architect of the facade in the 19th century was a Jewish man. In any case, if we go into Santa Croce and look at Giotto's murals of the life of St. Francis in the Bardi Chapel, so one of the chapels in this case commissioned, like the adjacent Peruzzi Chapel, by fabulously wealthy Florentine banking families, so very much, it would seem, antithetical to the anti-institutionality or non-institutionality of Franciscanism in Francis's own concept. We can think a little bit more about the impacts of decentering, both for Giotto, perhaps for Weil, but also for us. So if you look at the Bardi Chapel here, you can just sort of see it's actually this scene here. There's a middle one, and there's this one down here. I'm going to talk first about this, then this, and come back up to close with the stigmatization up here. In each case, try to make a point that's very referential to who we are as thinkers now. So the first of these images is of the renunciation of worldly goods, where St. Francis at a kind of moment, if you like, a kind of corner in the public square, where he's turned a corner and is once and for all renouncing his worldly father, the angry merchant here, and has demonstrated that renunciation by stripping off all his clothes and just giving them back to his father and saying, I don't need your clothes, and I'm now, my father is God in heaven, it's not you. And the bishop is, sympathetic, but also embarrassed by this eccentric act of piety in stripping down and becoming naked as a baby, and consequently covers St. Francis in his cloak, all part of the flowering legends of the saint in the 14th century. And by the way, you might be saying, how is it known that these paintings are by Giotto and the other ones are not? And well, these are by Giotto. I think I'll just leave it at that. I mean, I think it's clear, but authorship is not our question. In any case, looking at this, obviously the idea of renunciation is important, and for who we are and what we do when we renounce, and of course, what is a renunciation? And the picture answers very simply that it's turning one's faith, lifting one's hands to a higher power, unseen power. But there's more we can say about this, I think. If we look at a detail, I find it fascinating the way that the praying gesture here actually fantastically, or like in imagination, kind of creates the void between the Father and the Son. It's not just it's not just a backdrop, this wall, and that kind of true to the nature of what I spoke of earlier in a natural context as the texture of difficulty, and the difficulty of faith, if you like it's a rough hewn wall, that constitutes the image of the empty center here. Another one of Giotto's very powerful employments of, if you like, nothing at all in the heart of the image to make it palpitate, resonate. And all I'm saying is that the saint's gesture here seems to create that wall and that space. And it's a complex notion because walls seem to have to do with that which is ungenerous, but the poetry of these paintings is such that I don't think we can simply parse like what is the gesture of openness and possibility from the gesture of closure and renunciation. It's the poetry compounds these things. In any case, coming back to the image overall, yes, I mean, I look at the peace of the gesture of renunciation, that is peace, P-E-A-C-E, as against you could say the peace of the gesture of renunciation and unembarrassment and openness, like all of that is connected, as against the rage of restraint. It's the Father is being held back, and there is this kind of sharks versus the jets confrontation here between the merchants and the ecclesiastics. But then I noticed too, in terms of restraint, these kids, and I want to say something about them too. And I guess the way I can say it is by actually asking you to see something towards which Francis gestures, you might even say, towards which he prays, that is both visible and invisible in the work. And in Weian terms, it is, I guess you could say, the void, the sort of emptiness through which God enters. And what do I mean by that? I guess what I mean is, you see the lunette shape here of the scene, which is, if you like, not a part of the scene, it's just the architectural allotment space that Giotto had to work with. Yet I feel that Giotto is deeply aware of this, and that in praying up towards this invented piece of architecture, that's one thing, a kind of worldly palace, if you like. Francis is also praying up to the visible invisible of this lunette, this sphere, this circle, which is so compelling that one can easily imagine it as just the upper half of a circle that would continue down below the frame of what you see in the PowerPoint. In order to, I don't know, acknowledge what is not there, acknowledge that God has renounced being in the world so that we can kind of fill that void with our own attention, our own recitation, our own love, right? And, you know, even by a kind of subtle visual force that only a master artist such as Giotto could find, you know, there's even a way that this building here, in all of its Cartesian gravity and linearity and angularity, begins to bend and torque in relation to this unseen scene, visible, that are unseen scene, circle, sphere, heaven, that Francis alone in his gesture recognizes and prays to. And of course, he's the one with the circle around him, the halo. There's a kind of subtle sympathy and concert between his local circle and this vaster circle here. And Giotto, who's an artist that Weil felt, you know, was a great artist because there was no difference between his philosophy, like who he was at the dinner table or walking down the street, and what he painted. And who was alleged as a sign of his mastery to have been able to draw freehand using his arm, his hand as a compass, in a compass-like manner, to draw freehand a perfect circle, you know, could himself relate to these things. What do the kids have to do with this? Well, I think the first thing you have to notice is that they're on either side, and you might say, well, yeah, big deal. I mean, so they're on either side. But in back of the CC, which is probably a source for Giotto, the kids are more or less where we would expect them to be. They're the little rock-throwing brats who are described in all the stories of St. Francis, who are there to mock him and pelt him with stones, are on the side of the merchants over here. And narratively, prosaically, I guess that makes kind of sense, but Giotto distributes them to the edges here. And I do not really have an answer for why that is. Here's a detail of the rightmost of the two figures. But I would say this, that in a way I can only describe, I can't understand, their phenomena, each one, of circleness, of this vaster circle. You can see very clearly that the restraining mother here is bending in torque with the circle, with the lunette. And really, so it is over here too. You know, this arm down here. Yes, so I can only feel that there's some occult relation between the renunciatory centeredness of St. Francis here, and then these distributed kind of decentered figures here who are narratively St. Francis's enemies, but who somehow seem, perhaps because of his own childlikeness, to be occultly related to him, to be fellow knowers of the sphere. And beyond that, I'm not sure what to make of it. I want to go to this picture by Giotto, which is, as you'll recall, just 2 below the Renunciation in the Bardi Chapel, Santa Croce. Again, imagine Weil looking at these. You might say, what is all that, that horizontal effacement, defacement? And that's because long after Giotto painted this in the 19th century, I believe, a tomb was put in front of this piece, and then it was subsequently removed. And, you know, a 19th century restorer fancifully recreated a lot of what was lost. And then in the 20th century, those 19th century restorations were stripped down, and you have now, I don't know, a kind of strangely compelling palimpsest of different times in this picture. It is nonetheless, these effacements, they do not preclude us from getting, as it were, the focus of the picture. And the death of St. Francis, many people there attending, many of his fellow monks, as one monk up here, alone among the crowd, looks up and sees Francis rising to heaven. There's a very good detail here. And I think what I have in mind here as we think about decenteredness, you know, you might say this is like such a central scene, like to be present at this scene, etc., is incredibly meaningful and true in terms of being able to speak, to know a kind of true Orthodox conception of the saint and of his preaching, that it's trickier than that. And that again, our old friend, our old nexus of relation between decentering and faith is at play here. And what do I mean by that? Well, in a funny way, what I mean most trenchantly, or more trenchantly than anything I've said so far, is something that has to do with us now. And let me try to explain this. You know, I look at the gestures here in this work, and Giotto was a master of gestures. And I think that's one reason you can see that, you know, the other works are not by him. I love this from the art historian Moshe Barash, helping us to really look at the hands, for example, in something like this. And you're looking at not only grieving monks, but also one man who is examining, like Doubting Thomas, the wound in Francis's side to verify that it really is there. The major part of the expressive gestures that Giotto represented were taken from highly crystallized patterns of ritualized movement and behavior. Yet, Giotto did not distinguish between natural and conventional gestures. And you might look at this figure here, this here, this here. He infused gestures that appear to be conventional with us, with the spirit of life, of an immediate, often urgent psychological reality. And I think that's so well said. But then I want you to look at the figure I regard as the hero of this work, and the one with the most to say about decentering faith and us. And, you know, if you look at his look, he's the one who's looking up and seeing what no one else sees. Barash continues, on the other hand, he, Giotto, often imparted the quality of emotional restraint, usually characteristic of conventional gesticulation, to movements representing natural reactions, expressing agitated minds and turbulent experiences. So if there's a kind of naturalness to the conventional gesture in Giotto, there's also a kind of elegant, cultured restraint to extreme emotion here. And I think that's what this hand is here. Indeed, this figure's whole aspect, whole way of being. And here's why I like that figure, who seems so, look at his cloak, so quickly, summarily painted too, which I think is not insignificant. So if you like, modern. It's that he's right there in such a privileged position. His angle of face matches that of the dead saint. He is the Father Leo figure, like the amanuensis, the transcriber. But unlike everyone else, he looks away from the saint in order to see something no one else sees. And I think the gesture of the hand is relevant to that too. It speaks to, it turns back on himself. It echoes the circle of the halo. His whole way of being seems in kind of intimate, in an intimately external relation to the circularity that is Francis's otherworldliness. He's the, let me try to put it this way, he is the historian. He's the thinker. He's the philosopher. The one who cannot be defined or known simply by having been there, because in a way he's not there. He's apparitionally, vividly, intimately near the principle, the scene, the mystery, the moment of truth, but he's also kind of unpresent at the same time. He's a figure for me of the belatedness of the historian, the follower, the faithful follower, who, as a very demonstration of that faith, sees something no one else sees, who doesn't speak orthodoxly or according to what is in plain sight, who has a loving, emulatory relation to the circle and its turning, who turns back upon himself, who is inward in his reimagining of the perfect circularity of the adored, and that this constitutes an altogether more lowly, simple, decentered mode of thought. And, even without the quote, I think you get the sense of that then. And is there a cosmos in this at all, like a kind of cosmic import to being emulating of the circle, to be near it, outside it, excluded from it, but in relation to it, to use only one's own humble emotions as the articulation of something that is beyond the human? Guys, obviously, who could answer that? But I did think of this poem about Giotto's circularity and his fabled drawing of the circle, which I'll just read briefly as a kind of mystical and penultimate statement here. The view from here: Giotto drew a perfect circle with one quick turn of kohl, the shape of astonishment, forever's empty frame. It's as though this figure is astonished at the presence of the circle here. A coin on the tongue, how our eyes never are. But relax, love, into this world we're finding, and the perfect hurt of how it turns. I'll close with this image also from the Bardi Chapel. If I've said something just a moment ago about what I consider to be our relation to that which we study, if you want to say we are the Father Leos to Weil's St. Francis, and we are poised at the edge of that holiness, I think it's interesting to ask about Weil herself, like how is she present now for us, let's say? Obviously an unanswerable question, but taking Giotto's picture of the stigmatization, which you'll see is different from the one at Assisi, as a guide, let me just make a few remarks. A difference in this work is this cave here. And you know, in the Assisi work, there was a kind of hut, you know, was equivalent to the hut that Father Leo, who is now absent in Giotto's version, rightly so that you can have a distillation of the central drama between the kite flyer and the kite and their reciprocal making of one another. It's different with that cave, and I just look at that cave and it's such an interesting shape. You know, our mind says cave, okay, cave, got it, but it is connected to this hand. It seems stigmatic in a way, like a wound, a piercing into the mountainside. It also has a very clear relation to Jesus floating in the clasp of the six-winged angel. I think you can see that. You know, Weil said, I don't believe it can be maintained that the art of Giotto was unconnected with the Franciscan spirit. So again, this idea like this is a deeply thought cave, right? It's not incidental. It's throwing the central action out to this detail here. It's a simple detail, if you like, but to me, it's moving. It implies a kind of retreat, a hideaway, shelter, a wound. Something that withdraws from us with an ever greater intensity and darkness that is related to, you know, miraculous phenomena. And although it is putting it too simply or schematically to say it's, if you like, under the pressure of this reading, a self-portrait or a portrait of Weil, I think it can stand for us as one, as a sign of the ever withdrawing luminous darkness, the kind of enticing shadow and shelter of a way of thought. Thank you.
Yeah, we just thank you all for making the time on this beautiful Friday to listen to Simone Weil, Giotto, and Professor Nemerov.